7 in the morning, and Sumin was through the door before Michelle had taken her coat off. No knock, no greeting. She crossed the flat in 4 steps and shoved her phone directly into Michelle's face, breathing hard, hair loose from sleep, feet bare on the cold floor. She had run here, or near enough. The headline sat across the screen in bold, unforgiving type. Hanyul Academy donor Seonjae Yun, charged in connection with father's death. Below it, a photograph. Seonjae being walked toward a police car, his hands visible at his sides, his face turned slightly from the camera. Michelle did not look at the phone for long. She looked at her daughter instead, at the tight set of Sumin's jaw, at the brightness in her eyes that meant she was holding something too large for one person and had decided already not to drop it. He didn't do it. 1 sentence, no punctuation necessary. Michelle took the phone. She read the headline. She set it face down on the counter. Then she picked up her own phone and dialed.
This is V from V's Afro Soul Love. Welcome to another story.
Chapter 1. The flat was quieter than it had any right to be. Kes had made tea that nobody was drinking. Yuna sat at the far end of the sofa with her mug gone cold and her phone face down on the cushion beside her. Michelle stood at the window looking at the street below without really seeing it, and Sumin sat at the kitchen table with her notebook open in front of her, pen moving steadily across the page. She had been writing since she arrived. Michelle had not asked what. She understood Sumin put words on paper when the world inside her head was too loud to manage by any other means. She arranged the noise into sentences until the sentences made a shape, and the shape was always smaller and more manageable than the noise. It was one of the things about her daughter that had come to Michelle gradually, over months, as something she recognized. Adaize Nwali had answered on the second ring. When Michelle called an hour earlier, she always answered on the second ring. She had relayed the situation with the compact, structured precision. Adaize had listened without interrupting. Then she had said, in the level voice she used when her mind was already several moves ahead, I'm going to refer Seonjae's criminal defense to Kwon Tae-sol. He is the right person for this. My focus will be the parental responsibility filing, which I'm beginning today. Send me everything you have. Morning had come. They were still waiting. Kes refilled the kettle she had already filled twice. It was what she did when she could not fix something directly. She moved through kitchens with purpose, filled things that were already full, made tea for rooms that had not asked for it. She had been doing it since they were girls. Michelle had loved her for it the whole time. Then the phone rang. It was not Adaize, but a number Michelle recognized and had not expected. Mireille, calling from somewhere quiet, her voice arriving with a particular steadiness. I was there, Mireille opened, without preamble. The night it happened. I need you to know that before anything else. Michelle moved to the hallway, the flat stilled behind her. Tell me, she said. The book. That was what had brought Mireille to the house. A cookbook borrowed months earlier, the kind of small errand you keep meaning to run and never quite do. She still had the spare key from the years she had spent in and out of that house during Sumin's childhood. The lights were on. She let herself in without knocking, the way she always had, and then called out to announce herself. Nobody answered. She set the cookbook on the hallway table and was turning to leave when she heard Mrs. Yun's voice through the sitting room wall. Mireille described what she heard slowly. The words through the wall were not shouted. They were worse than that. They were chosen, cold and precise, and aimed. She had stood in the hallway with the cookbook in her hands and had not moved. Then the silence came. She pushed open the sitting room door. Mr. Byung-ho Yoon was on the floor. Mrs. Yoon was already crouching beside him when Mireille entered. She looked up. Her face was void of grief, void of shock. Her eyes just narrowed at the body before her. She said to me, Mireille's voice held its steadiness, though the effort beneath it was audible. She said very quietly, "You will say he was alone. You came afterward. You found him. Seonjae was here earlier, and they argued you heard it on your way in." A pause. And then she told me that if I said anything different, everything that happened 16 years ago would become mine to carry alone. She would produce documentation. She would say I was the one who took the baby, that Seonjae had been deceived the same as you, that all of it had been my doing. Michelle was very still in the hallway. "She was going to bury you under it," she stated. "Yes," Mireille confirmed. And I stood there for 30 seconds and I thought about what I did the last time someone told me to be quiet in a room where the truth was inconvenient. I thought about 16 years of Sumin counting the ticks of a clock in a hallway at night because there was nothing warmer to count. And I decided that I was not going to stand in another room and make the same choice I have regretted every single day since. Will you say all of this under oath? "I called a lawyer before I called you," Mireille answered. "She is filing my statement today. I understand there will be a formal cooperation agreement because of my own involvement. 16 years ago, my lawyer has already explained what that requires. I am prepared to accept it. I am not protecting myself this time. I am done protecting the wrong things." Michelle ended the call and walked back into the flat. Chapter 2. Sumin had stopped writing. She sat with her pen uncapped and her eyes on the hallway door. She had heard the murmur of the call through the wall, but not the words, and had already drawn conclusions from the silence around it. "Is he going to be all right?" she asked. Michelle set her phone on the table. She looked at her daughter, at the directness of her, the contained steadiness of a girl who had built that quality out of years of having no one to lean on and had turned it into something entirely her own. "We are going to make sure he is," Michelle declared. She called Adaiz. The conversation was 6 minutes long. When it ended, Adaiz had a list of 3 things she needed from Michelle within the hour, and 2 filings she was already preparing, one for Kwon, one for the family court. Kes set a cup of tea in front of Michelle without commentary. She sat across from her and looked at her sister with the particular frank attention of someone who understood that some moments required presence more than language. "What do you need?" Kes asked simply. "The afternoon," Michelle replied. "All of you give me the afternoon." Kes stood and went to find her coat. Yuna followed. Sumin capped her pen, closed her notebook, paused at Michelle's shoulder on her way out, and pressed her hand briefly against Michelle's, a quick, firm pressure, and then she was gone. The flat was quiet. Seonjae's allowed phone call came that afternoon. He used it to call Michelle. Not Yuna, not Mireille, not his lawyer. Michelle. The call was 2 minutes long. His voice was measured, yet when you listened closely you could tell he was barely holding on. He asked about Sumin first, then Mirai, then the legal situation. Michelle answered each question directly. Sumin was steady, Mireille had agreed to cooperate, Kwon and Adaiz were both moving. Before the line cut, he said one thing that was not about any of those things. "Thank you for answering," he offered simply. Michel sat with the silence after the call for a long time. From the kitchen doorway, Kes watched her sister and said nothing. She had known Michel for 38 years and was very good at reading the shape of what her sister was not saying. She went back to the kitchen and made more tea. It was, as always, the best thing she had. That evening, Sumin returned and sat at the kitchen table with a fresh page in her notebook. She wrote for 2 hours without stopping. When she finished, she read it back, changed 4 words, and wrote a title at the top. She folded the page and pressed her hand flat against it through the fabric of her jacket pocket. She did not show it to anyone, not yet. Outside, the city did its unremarkable evening things entirely indifferent to all of it, which was the only fair part of the evening. And in a police holding room across the city, Son Jae-yoon sat with his hands folded on a table and waited for morning, something he had never done before and had not been given a choice about now. Chapter 3. 48 hours later, Sonye walked out of police custody and into a pale Thursday afternoon. The evidence against him had not held. Kwon Tae-sol had moved immediately. The questioned document specialist was already examining the forged letter. Miraya's cooperation agreement was formally in place, and the medical examiner's preliminary report listed the cause of death as cardiac arrest, mechanism undetermined, pending further investigation. That was not enough to hold him. Not yet. But a trial date was coming, and everyone understood what that meant. Yuna was waiting outside the building. She did not run to him. She did not make a moment of it. She walked forward and stood beside him, which was all she had ever known how to do for him, and which, on this particular cold afternoon, was exactly right. He looked thinner. The 2 days had taken something from the surface of him, a certain managed composure that had been wearing thin for months, and had now, finally, come off entirely. Without it, he looked like what he was, a man who had been alone with himself for a long time and had come out the other side knowing things he had not gone in knowing. The first place he went was not home. He went to Michelle's flat. He did not call ahead. She had been watching for his car from the window for 20 minutes before it appeared at the end of the road. She saw him get out. She moved to the door. She opened it before he knocked. He stood in the doorway. She stood in the flat. Neither of them said anything for a moment. She stepped back. He came in. Kes, to her considerable and entirely silent credit, remembered a sudden errand, collected her coat without meeting anyone's eyes, and left. The flat went quiet around them. They sat at the kitchen table, 2 mugs, neither touched, and Sonye began to talk. The man did not mention anything about the case or the arrest or the bail conditions or any of the things that would need to be addressed soon enough. He talked about his father. He talked about the Saturday mornings when he was 7, when his father had taken him to the park, not because he particularly enjoyed parks, but because he had understood that a small boy needed an hour each week of pure and unstructured freedom. He talked about his father's hands broad, careful, the hands of a man who built things and understood the weight of material. He talked about the evening Byung-ho appeared at the office door during the worst month of the company's early life and sat beside him until midnight, not speaking, not advising, simply being there. He was not innocent, Sonia stated, his voice level. But he was the only one who came to me just once, a year after Sumin was born, and asked how I was. Not the company, me. He looked at his hands on the table. Nobody else asked that. Michelle listened without redirecting. She let the silences between his sentences stand the way they needed to. "He came to me," she told him, when she understood he had reached the end. "Before any of this, alone without your mother, without any of the apparatus of that family around him, he sat in an empty room and told me what he had built and what it cost. He said it without managing how I received it." Song Ye looked up. "You never told me." "It was his to give me," she replied, "not mine to pass on." He looked at her for a long moment. The kitchen light fell evenly across the table between them. Outside, someone walked past with a dog. "Why are you still doing this?" he pressed quietly. Not with accusation, with genuine bewilderment. "I'm not doing it for you," Michelle replied softly. "I'm doing it because Sumin's father should not be in prison for something he didn't do. That is where it lives. That is what it is." He nodded. He received it without trying to reshape it into something more convenient. He stood to leave an hour later. Michelle walked him to the hallway. It was narrow, the coat hooks she had always meant to relocate, crowding the left wall, and as he reached for his jacket, they were close. So close it brought back unwanted memories. He turned. She was right there. Chapter 4. The flat was quiet. Sumin was at Kess's hotel for the evening. Kess had arranged this without being asked and with the expertise of someone who had been engineering exits for people she loved her entire adult life. "Michelle," Sionia said. Just her name. No request behind it, no question. Simply her name in his voice, which had arrived in rooms without warning ever since he had come back into her life. She looked at him. She did not step back. He did not reach for her. They stood in the honest, accumulated weight of everything that had built between them, not only the months of this year, but the years before them, the library, the campus, the terrible morning she had walked out of a building carrying more than one person's worth of loss in her own body. Her phone rang. Adéis. The timing was what it was, and both of them understood it entirely. She held his gaze for one more second. He picked up his jacket. At the door, he paused. "Whatever happens between us, whatever that ends up being or not being," he stopped, began again. "Thank you for the table," he said, "not the furniture." She knew that. "I didn't know how much I needed someone to sit across from." He opened the door and walked out. Michelle turned toward the kitchen, phone to her ear, Adéis already speaking on the other end. Her eyes tracked his car as it pulled from the curb and disappeared around the corner. "Are you still with me?" Adéis pressed. "Yes," Michelle answered. "Say the last part again." 4 months later, the trial date was confirmed. On the evening before the first morning of court, Sumin appeared in the doorway of the small room off the hall that Michelle had been converting into a study. Michelle was at the desk, working through documents Adéis had sent. The lamp was on. The rest of the room was in the comfortable half-dark of a space that had recently become hers. "Can I show you something?" Sumin asked. Michelle turned. Sumin crossed to the desk and unfolded a page from her jacket pocket. She placed it on the surface and then turned to look at the bookshelf. Because some things were easier to offer when you were not watching the person receive them. Michelle read it once. Then again, more slowly. "This is the one," she said. "The one what?" Sumin asked, turning. "The one that is going to change something for everyone who hears it," Michelle replied. Sumin looked at her for a moment. Then she picked up the page, folded it along its original crease, and returned it to her pocket. "Good," she said. "I wasn't certain." She went back to the kitchen. The warmth of Kess's voice resumed in the other room. Michelle turned back to the desk, but she did not pick up the documents again for several minutes. She simply sat with her hands in her lap and let the feeling be exactly as large as it was. In the morning, the trial began. Chapter 5. The courtroom embodied the presence. All courtrooms had the specific, pressurized formality of a room where everything has been arranged to make truth feel procedural. High ceilings, fluorescent light that offered visibility without warmth. Rows of benches worn smooth by years of people sitting in them with difficult things on their minds. Michelle, Sumin, Kes, and Adaez occupied the public gallery. Adaez was there in her capacity as Michelle's family law solicitor. The criminal proceedings were Kwon Tae-sol's domain entirely, and she had been clear about that division from the beginning. Kwon was a compact and methodical man in his early 50s. He acted simply, carefully, and dismantled whatever was in front of him. He had reviewed every document. He had spoken to every witness. He knew exactly what was coming and had prepared for all of it. Mrs. Yun sat in the public gallery on the opposite side, not at the prosecution table, where she had no standing, but across the room in the civilian seats. Her lawyer, Jung Hyun Baik, had placed her there with instructions that Michelle could read clearly, even from a distance. Sit still, show nothing, give them nothing to work with. She faced forward. The prosecution opened with the letter. Baik presented it as the cornerstone of everything handwritten, signed with Seon-jae's name, allegedly threatening his father in the lead-up to a prior dispute. Baik was careful and thorough, building a picture not of violence but of escalation. A family in profound conflict, a father whose heart had given out under the weight of a confrontation that had gone too far. It was constructed. Michelle could see where the seams were, but construction had its own kind of authority in rooms like this one, and she watched the jury with peeled eyes and an unshakable focus. Kwon Tae-sol let the prosecution finish without interruption. Then he stood. He did not begin with the letter. He began with the medical examiner, Dr. Shin Bo-yeon, methodical and precise, who confirmed under cross-examination that the autopsy had found no physical evidence of confrontation, no bruising inconsistent with a fall, no defensive injury, no forensic trace of Seon-jae's presence in the sitting room beyond what would be entirely expected of a man who had lived in that house for the first 18 years of his life. In your professional assessment, Kwon pressed, standing at the evidence table with his hands clasped behind his back. Is there any finding in this examination that requires the presence of another person in that room at the time of death? Dr. Shin's answer was clean and direct. No. Kwon Tae-sol turned briefly to the jury before he sat. I want to be precise about something, he stated. Even if the argument the prosecution alleges occurred exactly as described, which the evidence does not support a verbal dispute that causes emotional distress, and that distress results in a cardiac event, does not meet the legal threshold for criminal homicide in this jurisdiction. There must be physical coercion, threat, or an act of aggression that satisfies that threshold. The prosecution has produced none of these. They have produced a letter. We will now examine what that letter actually is. He sat. Baik made a note. The jury watched. Specialist Yo Sherin, a question documents examiner from the university's forensic science faculty, had been analysing the letter for 3 months. She was a precise woman in her 40s who managed everything with a certain calmness. She presented her findings, methodically, no drama, no theatre, simply data laid before the jury in the order that made it impossible to dismiss. The VSC examination video spectral comparator analysis had revealed that the ink used in the signature was chemically inconsistent with the ink used in the body of the letter, indicating the signature had been added separately and at a different time. The ESDA analysis, electrostatic detection of pressure indentations in the paper, showed no corresponding marks in the pages beneath, meaning the letter had not been written on top of other documents as its claimed origin required. A comparison of the handwriting with 6 verified samples of Seonjae's writing across 3 axes of pressure and stroke formation showed patterns so divergent that the probability of common authorship was, in Specialist Yeo's professional assessment, negligible. The letter was a forgery. Baik cross-examined with considerable energy. He had deposed Specialist Yeo 3 months prior and had known the substance of her findings. He was not surprised, and he showed it, attacking the methodology with as many arguments as he could cook up. He found 2 minor procedural questions. He could not shake a single substantive finding. The jury watched everything carefully. Michelle watched the jury. Sumin watched her father. Sonjae sat at the defense table with his hands folded and his face steady. He looked at his lawyer. He looked at the charts. He looked once at the gallery. He found Sumin before he found anyone else. She sat straight-backed in the second row, notebook closed beside her, watching him and him alone. There was no performance in it, no forced reassurance, just presence, direct, full, without half measures. She gave him a nod, small, deliberate. At the defense table, his folded hands were not entirely steady, but the line of his shoulders changed. He faced forward. Michelle, beside Sumin, had watched both things. She looked at the side of her daughter's face, the focused stillness of her. She did not say anything, but Sumin knew she was being watched, and that was also a language between them now. Chapter 6. Mireille was called in the afternoon. Kwon Tae-sol had been careful about this. He addressed her involvement directly in his opening questions, before Baik could attempt to use it as leverage. He established clearly for the jury that Mireille had entered a cooperation agreement voluntarily and that her participation 16 years ago had occurred under explicit coercion by Mrs. Yoon, using the same pattern of threatened exposure the court was currently examining. The cooperation agreement had been granted because the authorities had determined her testimony to be credible and her culpability to be a product of that coercion rather than independent criminal intent. He gave Baik nothing to use. Baik tried anyway during cross-examination. He failed. Mireille entered the courtroom, and she was not the Mireille of the clinic car park. She had already given the hardest part of her courage to the decision months ago, and what remained for the courtroom was the delivery clean, clear, without ornament. She took the stand. She stated her name. She looked at the gallery once briefly, and then she looked at the courtroom and spoke to it directly. She described the hallway, the book, the key, the voice through the wall. She gave them the words, not paraphrased, not approached from an angle, but as she had heard them. She described the door she had pushed open, and what she had found, and what Mrs. Yoon had said to her, standing above her fallen husband, watching with calculated eyes and not the shock or grief that anyone would expect. She also told them, when Kwon led her there, about the night 16 years ago the food brought to Sonjae's flat, the sedation that had kept him unconscious and unreachable through the night of Sumin's birth, the phone that had been moved, the missed calls he had never heard. She described it without embellishment, as a further instance of the same pattern. Mrs. Yun identifying an obstacle, determining what was required to remove it, and acting without hesitation or scruple. The courtroom went very quiet. Across the gallery, Mrs. Yun sat with her back entirely straight and her eyes fixed on a point on the wall opposite. She did not look at Mirai. She did not shift or flinch. She held her composure with the rigid discipline of a woman who understood that any break in the surface now would cost her everything she had spent 30 years building. But her hands were not entirely still. Michelle, several rows behind her in the gallery, could see them. Kwon Tae-sol called Yuna next. Yuna took the stand with her brother's jaw and none of her family's talent for the management of appearance. She presented the documentation the letter Seonye had kept for 12 years, the evidence of financial leverage and forged documents and the threatened state placement. She had text messages. She had bank records tracing the capital guarantee. She had, in 16 years of quiet and careful private record-keeping, built a paper trail that Baek had known about. He had deposed her thoroughly and had spent the intervening months failing to find a way to neutralize. He cross-examined with energy. Yuna did not move. She had been fully prepared and waiting for this moment for years. Court was recessed for the day. The jury would begin deliberations in the morning. In the corridor, Michelle and Sumin moved side by side through the draining late afternoon light. Kes walked a few paces behind, giving them space the way she always gave space when it was needed. She didn't break, Sumin observed. Not a question. No, Michelle agreed. She won't. Not like that. Sumin was quiet for a moment. She'll break differently, but she'll break. It was said with a flat certainty. Michelle looked at her daughter walking beside her and did not say anything. She thought, not for the first time. This girl is going to be all right in the world, more than all right. She had the rare quality of seeing things clearly without it making her hard. That evening, Seonjae sat in the kitchen of his flat with his phone on the table in front of him and did not touch it. Yuna sat across from him and they talked without fear of saying the wrong things. The jury went into deliberations the following morning. 6 hours passed, then 7, then 8. Michelle was in her study, unable to read the page she had been looking at for 40 minutes, when her phone rang. Kwon Tae-sol. She answered before the second ring. Come back to the courthouse, he said. The jury is returning. Chapter 7. The verdict came quietly. Not guilty. 2 words. The 4 persons sat. The room found its breath again. Seonye sat at the defense table with his hands folded and his face steady. He pressed both palms flat against the surface, staring at his hands with a certain blankness. Sumin was already standing. She came down from the gallery and through the barrier door and crossed the courtroom floor and walked directly to her father. Seonye stood and wrapped both arms around her and held on tight. The hug was full. Present, Riao. Sumin's arms went around his back. She did not say anything. She did not need to. Michelle stood near the gallery barrier with Kes beside her. She did not try to compose herself. She had been learning in Dr. Soon's office and in her own kitchen and in a hallway with her hand pressed against a school bag on the floor that composed was not always the honest choice. She let the moment be as large as it was. Kes slipped her hand through Michelle's arm and held on. That was all. Eventually Sumin pulled back. She wiped her face with the back of her hand, the same gesture, the same unself-conscious way, and said something to her father that was too quiet to carry across the room, he answered. She nodded once, and then she looked across the floor toward Michelle. Michelle held her daughter's gaze across the distance of the courtroom. Sumin smiled. It was not the careful, half-withheld smile from the first week in classroom 4B, but the full one, open, direct. The smile of a girl who has found the place she was always supposed to be standing in. They filed out of the courthouse in the natural drift that follows a verdict, lawyers gathering papers, staff moving in their quiet and purposeful way, the dispersal of a room that has done its work and is releasing everyone back to the world. It was on the broad front steps that they met Mrs. Yoon. Not by design, not hers, not theirs. She was simply leaving at the same moment they were. Coming through a side door that opened onto the same landing, her lawyer a step behind her with his briefcase and his composed professional silence, there was no avoiding it. The steps were wide, but not wide enough. She saw Sumin. Sumin saw her. Sonye moved instinctively forward. Michelle put her hand briefly on his arm. He stopped. Sumin had already taken 2 steps toward her grandmother, and there was something in the quality of that movement, unhurried, deliberate, without any of the anger it could have carried, that stopped everyone on those steps. She stopped at a careful distance. Just the 2 of them in the cold, with the city spread out behind them and everyone else very still. "I know you didn't come here to find me," Sumin said, "so I'll be brief." Her voice was not raised. It did not need to be. "You made a choice that took my mother from me before I was old enough to understand what a mother was. I grew up in a house where nobody was unkind and nobody was interested, and I learned to count the ticks of a clock in a hallway at night because there was nothing warmer to count. I'm not telling you that so you feel sorry for me. I'm telling you because I want you to understand what you actually did, not the version of it you tell yourself, but the real one. The one with a baby in a hospital blanket in a car park at 2 in the morning. The one with a woman sitting alone in a clinic room being told her daughter didn't survive. A pause. That one. The composure on Mrs. Yoon's face held, but it was doing visible, considerable work. "I don't hate you," Sumin continued. "I want to be very clear about that. I don't have enough invested in you to hate you. What I have is clarity. I see exactly who you are, and I see exactly what you built, and I see the full cost of it, not to you, but to everyone who trusted you with their lives." She paused. "When I am ready to speak to you again, if I decide I ever am, I will come to you. Until that moment, don't come to me. Don't call my phone. Respect that, or I will set more boundaries than you have the energy to navigate." She turned. She walked back toward Michelle and did not look back. Michelle held the door for her daughter. Neither of them said anything about what had just happened. They did not need to. Baik put his hand very briefly on Mrs. Yoon's arm and guided her toward the waiting car at the bottom of the steps. She went without resistance, without looking after Sumin, without looking at Sonye. She looked straight ahead, her face void of all emotions. And the car door closed, and she was gone. Chapter 8. The coffee shop across the road from the courthouse was warm and indifferent to everything that had been unfolding across the street. Kes had claimed a table near the window. Ades was there. A pot of tea had arrived. They sat, all 5 of them, around a table that was technically too small and had been made to work anyway, and Sumin was mid-sentence, about something that had escalated considerably in the telling, both hands in the air. And Kes was laughing the full, unself-conscious laugh that meant she had stopped performing composure and was simply reacting. Michel sat beside Sionye, not across from him, beside him. She had not consciously decided this, and was aware of it only once she was already sitting, and she made no move to change it. He was aware too. Neither of them said anything about it. The tea was poured, the table was warm. Outside the window, the city moved past in its ordinary, indifferent way. And inside, nothing was ordinary, but everything felt, for the first time in a very long time, manageable. They had been there an hour when Songjay walked Michelle to her car in the car park behind the coffee shop. Sumin had stayed behind with Kes that afternoon. They stood beside her car. The car park was quiet. "I need to say something," Seonyai began. "Let me go first," Michelle said. He stopped. She looked at him. Their breath was visible in the cold, two separate clouds in the same air. "I have thought about this carefully," she said. "What I want, what Sumin needs, what is honest." She paused. "I am not able to give you what you want from me right now. Not because I don't feel what I feel. I think we are both finished pretending I don't feel it. But Sumin has to come first, not as a delay, not as a condition, as the actual priority. I have 11 months of knowing my daughter. There is no shortcut through that, and I am not looking for one." He received all of it without interrupting. "I'm filing for formal parental responsibility," she continued. "Legal recognition that I am her mother and that I have rights in decisions about her life, her education, her welfare, her medical care. Adaiz has the paperwork. I'm not asking your permission. I'm telling you because you have a right to know, and because Sumin deserves both of us in a room that is not a battlefield. I told Adaiz I won't contest it," he answered. "Before you filed." She looked at him. "You already knew?" "I hoped," he said simply. A pause that held many things and left most of them unsaid. "And the rest?" he asked, carefully. Chapter 9. "The rest is not a no," Michelle replied. "It is a not yet. Not like this, not when everything is still this close and this loud. You deserve an honest answer. And the honest answer is that I don't know. What I know is that my daughter needs me present, fully. That is the most important thing I can be right now. The only thing I am sure of is that I want a relationship with my daughter. Anything else is unimportant for now." He nodded. The slow, full nod of a man who had grown over months of being pressed into it, into someone who could receive an honest answer without immediately working to change it. "Then I'll be here," he said. "And I promise not to put any weight on you. I just want to be there. Just be present for Sumin. And for whatever comes after that, if it comes." "That is the right answer," she said quietly. The car park was cold. Their breath moved between them in the evening air, two separate currents, close enough to be almost one. She did not step back. He did not reach for her. 1 full second. 2. Long enough that the honesty of it was unmistakable to both of them, and neither was pretending otherwise. Then her phone rang. She glanced at the screen at ease and answered with the steadiness she had to hold at both ends. Michelle. Adaizi's voice was level and very precise. 2 things. The parental responsibility order came through this afternoon. It's granted. Michelle's hand tightened on the phone. She looked at Seonye. He could see from her face that something had shifted, and he waited. "And the second thing?" Michelle asked. "They arrested her this morning," Ades replied. "At the house, fabricating evidence and perverting the course of justice. Her lawyer was present. It was handled formally. I wanted you to hear it from me before it was anywhere else." Michelle stood in the car park with the evening coming down around her and the phone warm in her hand, and Seonje watching her with the patient attention of a man who has learned to wait for things to be ready. She lowered the phone. "The parental responsibility order came through," she said. Something crossed Seonye's face that had no single name. Something that was not any one emotion, but all of them at once, arriving too fast for any of them to fully surface. "And your mother was arrested this morning," she added. "ADE says it was handled formally." He was quiet for a long moment. Then he looked up at the darkening sky and back at her, and he drew in a breath. "Okay," he said, "just that word." But the way he said it, the exhale of it, the full and unglamorous weight of it, was its own complete. She looked at him for a long moment in the cold evening air. "Go home," she said. "Be there when Sumin wakes up tomorrow. That is still the most important thing you can do." He nodded. He turned toward his car. At the edge of the car park, he stopped and looked back at her just once. Then he walked on. Michelle stood beside her car for a moment longer. The evening was full around her, quiet and cold and ordinary. She looked at her phone. She looked at the empty car park. She looked at her own hands. Then she typed a message to Sumin. "Heading back. How's the tea?" The reply came in 4 seconds. "Kes is on her 3rd cup and won't stop talking about Dad. Come save me." Michelle read it. She stood in the car park and she laughed genuinely, fully, in the open evening air, and then she got in her car and drove back to her daughter. Chapter 10. The community literacy space opened on a Saturday morning in early spring, and the light that came through the large warehouse windows did what spring light does, arrived with conviction, turning every surface it touched into the beginning of something. Michelle had been there since 7. She had arranged and rearranged the chairs on the main floor twice, which had nothing to do with the chairs. She had restacked the children's section, painted in the warm blue. Yuna had spent 3 consecutive Saturdays getting exactly right, a considered and particular blue, the kind a child instinctively trusts. She had stood on the small stage at the back and looked out at the empty rows and understood what this room was. Entirely hers. Her name on the door not slid into a slot, but painted in clean letters on frosted glass, which had been Kess's doing, accomplished through a negotiation with the building management that Michelle had not been consulted on and had found out about only after it was done. The parental responsibility order had been framed by Ades at Sumin's specific request and hung on the wall of Michelle's study alongside the graduation photograph of a younger Michelle and the postcard from a place Sumin had decided she would visit when she was ready. It was not decorative. It was a fact on a wall. It said, "This child has a mother. The mother has rights. This is documented. This is real." Sumin had been the one to hang it. She had borrowed a hammer from the building manager and knocked the nail in with laser focus. The space filled slowly through the morning community members, school parents, a handful of Hanuel Academy students who had come on their own Saturday time. Principal Cha arrived with her husband, carrying a card signed by the full staff. Adaize came at 9 with flowers and a warm smile on her face. Damioke appeared at past with 2 coffees, handed one to Michelle without making a production of it, told her she had built something real, and went to find a seat. He was right, and she knew he was right. Kes had not gone back to London. Nobody had discussed this. She was simply still there, which was the Kes Abara version of a formal declaration of intent. Sonjay arrived at 9:45. He took the back row, not beside Michelle, not adjacent to any claim on the occasion. He came because Sumin had asked him to, and because this room was Michelle's, and he understood, without being told, that entering it required a particular kind of presence. He sat quietly, and he waited. The program began. 2 community figures spoke. A group of neighborhood children read a poem they had written together, which was the best thing that happened in the first 40 minutes, and the applause was the warm and genuine kind that does not require prompting. Then the MC read Sumin's name. The room settled. Sumin walked to the stage in her ordinary clothes, school jacket, dark jeans, the small enamel book pin on her bag strap that had been there since before any of this. She stood at the microphone with ease. She reached into her jacket pocket. She unfolded the page she had been carrying for months, the crease worn soft by the number of times her hand had pressed against it without unfolding it. She began to read. Stolen and Found was about a girl who spent her whole life being told she was half of 2 things, and had built her sense of herself out of the mathematics of division, half here, half there, never entirely either, never complete in either language or either mirror. And then she discovered that the missing portion of herself had not been absent. It had been taken. And the difference between absent and taken changed everything. Because absent meant something was simply never there, while taken meant it had always existed, and someone had decided without asking her that she should not have access to it. She read about the clock in the hallway, with the tick that was too loud. She read about a kitchen table and homework and a man at a doorstep who had the wrong face for a 7-year-old and every possible face for a 16-year-old who now understood exactly what she had been looking at. She read about a hospital room she had never been in herself but could describe with precision because her mother had described it to her one evening across a kitchen table, quietly, without softening it, because Sumin had asked, and Michelle had always believed that real questions deserved real answers. She read about hands. Rich dark brown and warm golden brown, long fingers, rounded nail beds, and the specific, enormous, wordless understanding of looking at a part of yourself in another person's body and knowing, for the first time, exactly where you came from. The room was completely still. This was not the expectant hush of an audience anticipating a performance. It was a different silence altogether, the profound quiet that blankets a space when a collective realization dawns that something authentic is being witnessed, leading everyone to remain hushed out of instinctive respect. Sumin finished. She folded the page. She looked up. She stepped back from the microphone. The applause began before she had fully stepped away. Chapter 11. At the back of the room, Michelle did not compose herself. She had been learning in Dr. Soon's office, in the hallway, with a school bag on the floor. In every moment, she had allowed herself to feel the full size of something, rather than reducing it, that composed was not always the honest choice. She pressed 2 fingers, briefly, to her lips. Sonjay was 2 people away in the same row. He had not looked at her during the reading. She had not looked at him. They had both looked, without moving, at the girl on the stage, the girl who was both of them, and neither of them, and entirely magnificently herself. When the applause settled and Sumin stepped down, she looked up and found them both in the back row. Michelle first, then Seonye, and then both together. Michelle held her daughter's gaze. Present, certain, there. Sumin nodded once. Then she went to find Kes, who had been quietly crying since the second paragraph and had made no effort whatsoever to conceal it, which was its own form of tribute. The afternoon took its course. Conversation, warmth, the easy comfort of a room full of people who have found a reason to be in the same place. By 4, the crowd had thinned to the people who had stayed to help close up. Kes was in the children's corner, deep in conversation with Adaiz. Yuna was returning books to shelves with the focused, unhurried care of someone who has decided that useful is today's form of love. Seonjae left quietly. He said goodbye to Sumin first, a brief, private exchange, just the two of them, that Michelle did not try to overhear. Then he caught her eye across the room. He held it for a long moment, 3 seconds, 4 in the warm, ordinary afternoon light of a room that was hers, with everything between them fully present and neither of them hiding from any of it. He raised a hand, a small, quiet gesture, a held gaze, not a conclusion. She held it back. She did not look away first. She let the moment be exactly what it was without reducing it to something smaller. Then he walked out, and the door swung closed, and the room went on. An hour later, the space was quiet. Everyone else had gone. Sumin and Michelle moved between the shelves in the easy, companionable rhythm they had grown into over months, without discussing it the same pace, the same pause before a keeping decision, the same slight tilt of the head when a title caught their attention. Sumin stopped at a shelf, ran her finger along the spines, stopped at a gap. Someone already took Homegoing, she noted, deeply satisfied, on the first day. Good, Michelle replied from the next shelf. A comfortable silence settled between them. Then Sumin took out her phone. She held it for a moment without looking at it. Then she opened her contacts. I found it, she said. Michelle turned. The better word, Sumin said. The one I said I would find. Michelle set down the books she was holding. She crossed the room. She looked at the phone. The contact had been renamed. One word, where Michelle's name had been. Onyi, mother. In Orobo Michelle's father's language, the Delta side, the grandfather who had collected hats for no particular reason other than that he liked them, who could make anyone laugh within 5 minutes, who had been gone for 4 years, and whom Sumin had never met and would never meet, and that was one of the losses Michelle could not give back. Michelle looked at the screen for a long moment. She did not speak immediately, because some things arrive in you before the language for them does, and the honest response was to let that process happen. Where did you find it? She asked very quietly. I asked Kes, Sumin answered. She cried before she told me. I took that as confirmation. Michelle looked up from the phone. She looked at her daughter at the high cheekbones and the full mouth and the voluminous dark hair and the long fingers and the rounded nail beds and the extraordinary, undiluted self that had grown inside all of that into the most complete person she had ever been in a room with. It is exactly right, she said. She held out her arms. Sumin stepped into them without hesitation. Michelle held on. Both arms. Nothing managed or contained about any of it. She pressed her cheek briefly against her daughter's hair and stayed there, in this room that was hers, in this moment that was theirs, and let it be as large and as warm and as real as it actually was. Sumin held on back. Outside the large windows of the literary space, the city was doing what it always did, lights coming on as the evening arrived, people passing, a child on a bicycle, a woman laughing into a phone, the complete and beautiful indifference of a world that had not paused for any of this. Inside, a woman who had spent years moving through cities to keep grief in its container stood in a room that had her name on the door, with her daughter in her arms, and understood clearly, fully, without a single remaining condition, that she was not going anywhere. She was already exactly where she was supposed to be. The end. In the spring program notes for the city's annual Youth Spoken Word Festival, under the name Sumin Yun, the biography read one sentence: "I come from both sides of myself, and I am no longer choosing." Her mother was in the front row the night she performed. Her father was 2 seats away. Neither of them had planned it. That was how most of the best things happened. Before you go, I need to know. Was it the nod across the courtroom? The word Oni on the phone? The 2 seats apart at the end? Tell me the exact moment this story broke something open in you, because every story I build on this channel is built for that moment. Like this video if it delivered. Share it if someone you love needs it. Subscribe to V's Afro Soul Love and come back Sunday. There is always another story waiting.